Life is a big mystery, isn't it? It always has been.
Idiots can operate it, and indeed many do.
Drama is life, with the dull bits cut out.
Alfred Hitchcock is one of the most influential directors in history, with a career spanning 50 years, from his silent films of the 20s all the way until his death in the 70s. The guy's filmography is huge, mainly covering suspenseful spy thrillers, murders, and some dark comedies. He pioneered several techniques and pushed the boundaries of what could be shown on the big screen. Yeah, there are some duds here and there that appeared later on in his career, but the good definitely outweigh the bad. And the guy had one of the best hot streaks in Hollywood that anyone's ever really seen, just putting out banger after banger. His films have been talked about and covered to death at this point, so there isn't really much I could say that hasn't already been said. So what I want to do is approach things just slightly differently. Instead of talking about his most popular movies that many of us are aware of, I want to take some time and talk about some of his lesser discussed movies. I say lesser, but to be honest, most of his films are talked about to some degree. Now, I didn't know what to call this video. I was thinking of having the word classic somewhere in there, but to be fair, some of these are far from his best work, and really this video is just kind of an excuse to talk briefly about other Hitchcock films that some of you might not be aware of, or maybe just not talked about as much. This won't be like a full review or breakdowns. It's just kind of me shooting the shit and yapping, really. Now, I will say now, there'll be a few movies on this list that make you go, that movie's great, of course it's a classic. Because mostly all his films are talked about in some capacity, like I already said. But when compared to the heavy hitters, they aren't talked about nearly as much. Also, keep in mind I haven't seen all of his movies. The guy has over 50 directing credits, so I haven't seen everything he put out, but I try to get my hands on as much as possible. I think the best way to approach this would be chronological order. So we're gonna go order of release. And what's fascinating about Hitchcock is that he's one of those directors that you can just see him getting better and better with each film. Also, I'm not gonna go too much into detail about the plots of these movies, because some of them actually have really incredibly simple setups. And I don't really want to spoil the surprises for you, because honestly, the best part of watching a Hitchcock film are all the twists and turns and reveals. So I'm going to be pretty vague for some of these, but that's because I don't want to spoil anything. And here's a quick list of movies that will not be mentioned in this video.
So throwing the theme to Alfred, I'll channel him like the Panama Canal. But how could I get...
Alright, you ready? Let's get into it. Before I get into it, I'm going to give a quick honorable mention to two films. The first is The Lodger, released in 1927, and Blackmail, released in 1929. The Lodger was Hitchcock's last silent film, and probably his best. Though the idea is interesting, it doesn't quite build suspense the same way that future Hitchcock films do. It's a decent thriller, but it's very clearly a young Hitchcock still learning the ropes. Blackmail is in a similar situation. It was Britain's first sound film called talkies back then, and the idea, again, is pretty interesting, but it doesn't quite stick the landing, or again, build mystery and suspense the same way his later films do. You can tell by watching these films that it was made by a younger Hitchcock, who's still working on his craft. In The Lodger, he's still working on getting the fundamentals down, and then in Blackmail, he's learning how to implement sound and dialogue, since that was brand new at the time. So with these two movies, all the pieces are there for a Hitchcock film, and with all of his early work, you can see him piecing things together and working on his craft, especially when it comes to murder, mystery, suspense, and thrills. So I at least wanted to mention these two films here, because this was around the time he started to really grow as a director. But now let's move on to the actual list, starting with The Lady Vanishes. Now we're getting into some good shit. The Lady Vanishes was released in 1938 and is honestly a personal favorite of mine. So we follow a young girl who's traveling across Europe who meets a nice elderly woman. They befriend each other before they go on a train, but then the old woman disappears. So now with the help of this carefree guy who's also traveling around Europe, they try to find out what happened to this old woman. This movie combines mystery, suspense, and comedy into a tightly written package. You're left wondering if the old lady is actually real, or maybe she actually is. And if she is, why is everyone lying? You discover more and more clues and evidence of her disappearance, and then the plot starts to thicken even more. And you start to wonder, who are these people and what's their end goal and why are they doing this? Where did she go? Is she real? It's a great fun, it has several twists and turns, and even though it follows several groups of characters and has their storylines merge at certain points, it never loses focus and stays pretty tight. I think this is one of Hitchcock's earliest films where you can watch it and be like, oh yeah, he did this. It has clever reveals, good humor, and so much mystery. I don't have a negative thing to say about this movie, so go ahead and watch it and check it out. It has laughs and it has thrills. It's a fun time, so enjoy yourself. Next is Shadow of a Doubt. See, now we're getting into the golden era of Hitchcock. Amongst them was a personal favorite of his called A Shadow of a Doubt, released in 1943. Shadow of a Doubt follows a girl named Charlie, who's bored of her life in the suburbs and craves something more, and she gets her wish when her Uncle Charlie arrives, though it might have been more than she bargained for. You see, Uncle Charlie is on the run from the police, because he may have murdered two different women, and now that the authorities hot on his tail, she must look into it to find out if it's true or not. Now, this one takes a little bit to get going, but it's definitely worth it, because the more the story unfolds, the more intriguing it all becomes. And the more you learn about Uncle Charlie, the more you just don't want to be around him. The guy puts on a good facade, but the mask starts to slowly slip. Now, there aren't many big and grand set pieces, and it's more about the characters and seeing the plot unfold than it is spectacle. But the story and characters are really strong and keeps you engaged the whole time. Apparently, this is one of his personal favorites, and it's not hard to see why. It's a slow starter, but once it gets going, it's great. Next is Rope. Released in 1948, it's one of Hitchcock's first color films, and it's usually best known for being filmed in one take. However, that comes with a bit of an asterisk. You see, it's not all one continuous shot, because the cameras back then couldn't hold enough film to actually do that. So it's actually a series of about 10-minute long takes all blended together, and Hitchcock uses some pretty creative transitions to help hide the cuts. So it's still pretty impressive, but the fact that it was filmed in one take kind of overshadows the movie itself, because the movie is just simply fun. You see, we got these two college boys who kills one of their classmates and stuff his body in a trunk because they wanted to see what it was like to kill someone. But then they take it a step further by hosting a dinner party while no one else is aware of the fact that one of their classmates is dead in the trunk, where they're all just standing around partying. And they basically plan this as like a power trip, really. Almost like they're bragging that they got away with it. At least that's how one of them sees it. And what follows is really a game of waiting to see if anyone finds out. It's such a simple but fun concept. And the fact that it was filmed in one take kind of hinders the fact that all around it's a very suspenseful, fun thriller. And you're just waiting to see who finds out that there's a dead guy in the trunk. Again, it's another personal favorite of mine. Next is The Trouble with Harry. Released in 1955, it came out in between two absolute classics, that being Rear Window and The Man Who Knew Too Much. And because of this, I think The Trouble with Harry gets easily overlooked when looking back. Same with To Catch a Thief, that was released in the same year. But The Trouble with Harry sticks out to me more because it's different from a typical Hitchcock movie. In fact, it's a dark comedy. The focus isn't really on conspiracies or espionage or mystery, but instead it's about these regular people dealing with a dead body, and how they just see it as a nuisance. No one is taking the situation seriously, and with some quirky characters thrown in, it makes for such a fun experience, and you're just baffled by what they do next. Oh, I didn't tell you what the movie was about, did I? Well, let me tell you, dear viewer. Basically, some locals come across a dead body, and they try to figure out what happened to him and what to do with him. That's basically it. Hitchcock usually has dark humor somewhere in his films, but here it's front and center, and it really shows that honestly, he can do comedy very well. Of course, it's more macabre, and with him being British, it's very dry, but the characters being so nonchalant and downright goofy at times makes for such a fun viewing experience. Definitely worth checking out for some good laughs. Now, the final film on this list is Frenzy, released in 1972. You might notice that we skipped like a large portion because the last film we just talked about was 1955. That's because the late 50s and the early 60s was basically the Hitchcock golden era, where he put out some of his best films. But in contrast, the mid 60s to late 60s are when he put out some of his worst. Or I guess I should say, his more lackluster and underperforming movies. He was doing quite a few spy thrillers at this time that just weren't hitting the mark. But then in 1972, he released Frenzy, which felt more like a return to form. It focused on things that Hitchcock movies were known for. It had the wronged man, it had a murder mystery, it had a serial killer, but now it was the 70s, so Hitchcock was able to get away with so much more on screen. And so there is a bit more sex, a little bit more nudity, and a bit more dark humor. It has all the elements of a Hitchcock film, but with a grittier look and feel to it. And the story is just very simple. It's about a man who's on the run from the police because they suspect that he is a serial killer, and so he must find a way to clear his name. Now, even though this wasn't Hitchcock's last movie, it's actually his second to last, people consider this like his final swan song because it just feels like a return to form for him, especially that late in his career. And honestly, it is a rather good film. You have all the Hitchcock staples there, but this time just a bit grittier. The only downside is really the music. I don't think it fits most of the time, but it's alright. I think the plot, the characters, the thrills, and the murders definitely make up for it. So if you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend checking it out. It starts off pretty slow, but once it gets going, it's good. And yeah, I guess this is going to do it for the video, guys. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, go and drop a like on it. I just want to take this time to talk about a few Hitchcock films that don't get that much attention, or maybe you never heard of them. And hopefully you decide to check them out. You can actually find most of them like on streaming services, like Tubi, and even YouTube has a bunch, for free. And of course, if you want, you can always just rent them, or even buy them. Most of these are pretty easy to get your hands on. Yeah, I don't got shit else to say, so see ya.
Putin uses the N-word.
You're cute and you care.
Oh, not in front of Buzz.